Imagine going into a marriage with someone that you met only a few days ago. Now imagine going into a marriage with someone you have never even met, never seen a photo of them, never heard their voice, and on top of that, you find out that your future spouse doesn't even speak the same language as you. Now imagine that on a scale that is over 250,000 people who are in that exact situation. They are known as the Moonies, or the Unification Church, followers of the Christian teachings of Sun Myung Moon, a Korean preacher who believed that the second coming of Christ was going to happen in Korea, at a time that happened to be right around when he was born. From 1910 to 1945, Japan occupied Korea and systematically attempted to erase Korean culture and to pressure Koreans into no longer practicing their own faith, but instead a faith that was designated by Japan. Desperately wanting to cling on to any sort of culture and religion they had left, Korean Christians were meeting to worship privately, and that was exactly how Moon started to grow his roots. Over the years, people have started to accuse the Unification Church of brainwashing its members, of guilting them into buying exorbitantly priced items that were to allegedly appease ancestors and help future generations. There is even a theory that the assassination of Japan's former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, was directly related to the church. So the question remains, how much of Moon's intentions were to genuinely help spread the word of God and help those who struggled under the terribly heavy and controlling weight of Japanese rule? And how much of this was done for profit? This episode is about Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church in Korea. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class Podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. The Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945 had a huge impact on Korean life, as Japan was actively trying to suppress Korean culture. They wanted Koreans to assimilate into their way of life. The use of Japanese language in schools and public offices became mandatory. Korean history was rewritten to glorify Japan's role and to reduce the Korean narrative. This caused a loss of cultural heritage among Koreans, and Japan put restrictions on traditional practices and customs, causing Koreans to resist these changes. Korea's resources were exploited for the Japanese benefit. The government seized huge tracts of land for agricultural production, which forced Koreans to move into labor or to have to live on barren lands. Industries were also integrated, which stifled local businesses and led to enormous economic disparities. Koreans were facing poverty and growing resentful towards Japan, which started to fuel nationalist movements. Japan changed governmental structures and replaced them with laws that denied Koreans basic freedoms and reduced their civil rights. People who fought against these laws, intellectuals, activists, would face imprisonment, censorship, or torture. Independent movements started across the country, and as time went on, different forms of Korean nationalism started to appear as citizens longed for independence from a strict regime. People advocated for their rights and sought freedoms. Christianity was introduced in Japan in the 16th and 17th centuries, and in Korea it was introduced in the 18th century. Both nations welcomed the faith, albeit hesitantly. However, later, both Korea and Japan became scandalized because the Catholic Church had closed their borders to foreigners, expelled missionaries, and persecuted native Christians, which caused the Christian church in both Japan and Korea to go underground. During the Japanese occupation of Korea, Christian churches in Korea were having difficulties with the government. Christianity was the most influential force in the country, and it was brought to Korea by Catholic converts in the 1780s. These converts had learned about Christianity from their tribute missions to the court of Beijing. At that time, Christianity was outlawed because of rights controversy, which was whether or not Christians should be permitted to observe Confucian memorial ceremonies towards ancestors' spirits. Catholicism was persecuted through to the 1870s and didn't find a real foothold in Korea until the 20th century. The first Protestant churches that were set up were indigenous churches that had been founded by Korean merchants who learned Christian teachings during their travels to Manchuria in the 1860s, which is located in Northeast Asia, mostly in Northeast China. There was a surge of missionaries that came from mostly North America to Korea to teach Christianity. This became especially important as Korean culture was being erased by Japanese imperialism and control. Christianity appealed to Koreans not just for spiritual reasons, but due to economic reasons, due to its association with Western modernity. Koreans were also drawn to it due to nationalist reasons as well, as it was one of the few things not completely under Japanese control. The Meiji Restoration, which started in 1868 in Japan, came to be associated with the huge political, economic, and social change that moved the country into a more modern mindset and caused the westernization of the country as well. At this time, Shintoism was also transforming itself, in part because of the anxiety that was associated with the growth of Christianity in the country and the Western colonial powers encroaching on their life, many people wanting to remain a strong nation against the influence of Western dominance. In order to create this Pan-Asian empire that Japan dreamed of, the Japanese state started to combine elements of Japanese culture, which included the system of shrine Shintoism, into a state religion called State Shinto. It was these three elements that Japan wanted to focus on, and that was the importance of the divine gods/spirits known as kami, in particular, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, which was believed to be an ancestor of the emperor, the myth of the eternally reigning imperial family, and Japan's superiority over other nations. The Shintoism of the early 20th century thought that the world would be dominated by Japan and other countries would pay tribute to Japan. Shintoism became more controlled by the state. The government used people's belief in Shintoism to further gain loyalty from the masses towards Japan's imperial aspirations. However, people did participate and actively embrace this change. During Japan's occupation of Korea, Christianity was technically protected as a legal religion, but it was already entrenched within Korea. But later, state Shinto and Christianity came into confrontation with each other. The Manchurian incident, which was when Japanese troops had seized the Manchurian city of Mukden, now called Shenyang in China, solidified Japan's desire to want to increase the intensity of the Japanization of Korea. They wanted to expand, and so for that, they needed to guarantee that their Korean subjects would be loyal. By 1932, it was compulsory for school personnel, including students, to attend and worship at Shinto shrines, insisting this, quote, was not a religious act, but a political expression of patriotism, end quote. The suggestion to worship at a Shinto shrine would be deeply offensive to Christians and to Shinto worshippers alike. They are not the same religion. Shinto is an indigenous religious belief and practice that was introduced in Japan in the 6th century CE. It lacks a unifying ideology. It has existed alongside other faiths such as Buddhism in the medieval period and in the 17th century, Neo-Confucianism. There is no founder, there aren't any official scriptures, nor fixed dogmas. Practitioners of the Shinto religion believe that it has simply always been there. The key concepts include harmony, family, respect, purity, and choosing needs of many over the needs of the self. It came into use to distinguish between Buddhist beliefs and indigenous Japanese beliefs. Shintoism has altered Neo-Confucianism to join its ethical ideology. As Japan expanded the territory, it combined the elements of these two practices with a totalitarian governmental policy which wanted to unify the people of East Asia in competition with the Western Allied powers. Imperial Confucianism became the dominant form of state Shinto religion until 1945 with the fall of the Japanese Empire. According to Won-Suk Chang, who wrote Euro-Japanese Universalism, Korean Confucianism, and Aesthetic Communities, said about Japan that, quote, Japan transformed itself along the Western model of the aggressive nation-state, defined itself as a paradox, part of a larger community of oppressed Asian nations standing against a Western hegemony, while also being the most westernized civilized country among the Asian nations. End quote. In 1919, there was a series of demonstrations for Korean independence that started on March 1st in Seoul, also called the Samil Independence Movement. Later, after Korea's liberation and the Japanese occupation was over, communists likely attempting to claim nationalist legitimacy and under the emerging North Korean communist regime through ceremonies commemorating the March 1st demonstrations by framing them as anti-imperialist, proto-communist struggles. Christian clergy refused to attend and about 60 ministers were arrested. In solidarity, Christians went ahead and had their own ceremony with about 10,000 people in attendance in Siangdong Church in Xiangyang. The church was raided by security police, and in turn, protesters flooded the streets. Due to massive opposition, the authorities started to use different tactics, such as infiltrating churches and exploiting divisions. The communists hired the maternal uncle of Kim Il-sung, Protestant leader Kang Yang-uk, to persuade the Christian community from getting out of politics. He had a pro-communist Christian league set up in 1946 that wasn't successful at first. He urged Christians to worship at Shinto shrines during Japanese rule. And by 1949, ministers were forced into the league, and if they refused, they were arrested. The Korean War started in 1950, only a few years after Japan's surrender in August of 1945, which caused Korea to be split arbitrarily along the 38th parallel. The war started with South Korea being invaded by North Korean troops, which were equipped by the Soviet Union and supported by Chinese troops. The idea was to unify South and North Korea under communist rule. The war ended in 1953 with massive casualties and destruction across Korea. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, also known as the DMZ, is one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world, and it lies between North and South Korea on the 38th parallel. North and South Korea became very different regimes. Even though Korea was not split into North and South Korea until midway through the 20th century, for the sake of confusion, I will be still referring to it as North and South, even if I am discussing a time when Korea was still unified. Reverend Sun Myung Moon was born in 1920, and he was raised in the Presbyterian Church. By the age of 16, he claimed that he had received a message from Jesus saying that he had been chosen to fulfill the mission of establishing God's kingdom of heaven on earth. And in 1941, he enrolled as an electrical engineering student in Japan. According to tparents.org, which is the official website of Reverend Sun Myung Moon and is sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation, which was founded by Moon and his wife in 2005, Moon had been arrested by the Japanese occupation government in Korea in 1944. His name had allegedly come up during an interrogation of a communist friend/student of Moon who had been active in the anti-Japan underground in Tokyo. Moon had been labeled a threat due to him being a leader in the Korean independence movement against Japan's occupation of Korea. Moon was tortured while in prison, but refused to confess, and eventually he was released. In 1946, he traveled to Pyongyang to teach publicly despite the dangers he faced in communist territory. Before World War II had occurred, Pyongyang was the center of Christian activity in Korea and was considered the Jerusalem of the East, and that was before Korea was split into North and South. Moon, along with thousands of other war refugees, went to Busan, where he and a disciple of his had built the beginning of the Unification Church out of army ration boxes that had been discarded. His wife, Sang Il-choi, joined him. Moon was putting so much dedication into his mission that his wife could not accept it, and later she filed for divorce, despite him trying to dissuade her. Their only child from that marriage is allegedly still a loyal follower of Moon's teachings. Moon did not start out preaching his beliefs by wanting to separate Christianity into a separate denomination. Instead, he wanted to work with other Christians so that together they could build God's kingdom on earth. But his teachings weren't received well by already established Korean Christian churches. He believed that the reason that humans were created is to experience love. He preached that Adam and Eve had sinned by fornicating, and that was not God's purpose. Due to that mistake, humans have become selfish in their love, and through Moon, it was God's idea to restore his original plan. According to Moon, God's plan, which would need to be executed through Messiah, had been thwarted as Jesus did not marry, and therefore he did not complete God's plan. Jesus was supposed to live much longer in order to be able to fulfill God's wish to save humanity and bring about a sort of providence. Moon taught that Korea was the next Israel and that Jesus would return to Korea, but not in a way that was expected, spiritually or supernaturally, but that the mission of Jesus would pass on to another, which Moon implied that he was the new Messiah. He preached that creation is seen as complementary opposites, a negative and a positive that come together and form a unit. That unit then creates another whole, and eventually at the more complex level, those units become male and female and then man and woman. God created Adam and Eve so that once they have matured in Eden, they would join together in a God-centered marriage. The children they had would go on to populate the earth and form God-centered families. However, the archangel Lucifer, who is portrayed as a serpent in the book of Genesis, had been entrusted to act as the guardian towards Adam and Eve. But Lucifer became jealous of Adam and spiritually seduced Eve. She then physically seduced Adam before God gave them their marriage blessing. The fall of man was not done by eating a piece of forbidden fruit, but rather misusing love by gaining knowledge in the forbidden act of sexual intercourse. Therefore, the children of Adam and Eve inherited the original sin, and the families were Lucifer-centered rather than God-centered. Jesus was sent to act as a second Adam, but he had failed by being killed before he was able to complete God's mission, which was to marry the new Eve and have a God-centered family. Therefore, many parallels have been drawn up between Jesus' death and up to the 20th century, in which it was believed that the second Adam or Messiah would be born in Korea between 1917 and 1930. It should escape no one's notice that Moon happened to be born in 1920 in what is now North Korea. When Moon prayed, sweat, tears poured from his body. Kim In-ju, one of his followers, said that, quote, "I had never been so deeply struck by anyone's prayer in my life," end quote. It touched her so much that she found herself crying. That night, she dreamed of Jesus, and in an attempt to once again see Jesus in her dreams, she started to follow the teachings of Moon and attend his services. Kim In-ju brought her 18-year-old nephew to the sermons, named Kim Won-pil, and Kim found himself feeling peaceful and trusting Moon. Moon told him once that, quote, "Please remember, our group is very unique. It is totally unlike anything in the past or anything that will develop in the future. In all history, there is only one group like this." End quote. Moon started a routine. In the morning, he would get up before the 10 a.m. Sunday service and he would pray for hours. Some of his followers, the women, would pray overnight and would come early on Sunday morning to pray as well. Some spouses became suspicious and would come to see what was happening and would witness men and women in the same room singing and talking for hours. This was considered to be unusual because at the time in Korea, customs prohibited contact with members of the opposite sex. Moon explained to his followers that the fall of man was sexual in nature, and due to that, it broke God's heart that he lost his children to a sexual awakening. Many of his followers felt impure and would stop having sex with their spouses. Due to the opposite gender spending several hours in a room praying, singing, and talking together, rumors of orgies being conducted started to go around. One husband became convinced that Moon was having an affair with his wife, and he reported him to the communist authorities. Moon was arrested on August 11, 1946, and taken to the Daedong police station where he was charged with disturbing the social order. Among the prisoners was a man named Mr. Hwang, and he asked Moon to sit beside him. He told Moon that he was a member of a religious group called In the Belly Church that had a revelation that they would meet their Messiah in prison. The religious group was led by a woman named Ha Ho Bin and other group leaders that were being held in a nearby cell. After being asked why they were being held there, Hwang said that if they denied their revelation, that they would be let go. But the leaders of their group were refusing to deny the revelation. A small note, but the reason why they were called In the Belly Church was because it was said that when Ha had a revelation, her belly moved as if she was pregnant, although she was not. Moon told Hwang to pass this on. Quote, "Your group is specially prepared by God. I will take all responsibility if you deny to the authorities your experiences. Just deny the facts and you will be released. Tell Mrs. Ha to do the same." End quote. Ha refused to accept this, and so Moon wrote her a note written in mud by a fishbone on a white cloth, and the note said, quote, "The writer of this note has a mission from heaven. Pray to find out who he is. If you deny everything you have received, you will be released." End quote. The note was discovered by a guard and Moon was tortured, his interrogators trying to get him to admit that he was a spy for the American military government, which at the time was ruling in South Korea. Moon was not allowed to sleep for several days, and each time he would start to fall asleep, a guard would yell at him or hit him. And he learned how to eventually relax his body enough to keep his eyes open so it looked like he was awake, and that gave him some respite from being forced to stay awake. He was also not allowed food either, and he was beaten up. Eventually, on October 31st, he was declared innocent by a Soviet investigator. His followers came and collected him. He was half dead from being beaten. His clothes had stuck to his body from his wounds, and he was vomiting blood. There was a fear that Moon would pass away, but after 3 weeks, he began to recover, and in December, he started to teach again. In August of 1945, the United States and Soviet Union divided control over Korea, splitting it arbitrarily along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Army set up a communist regime in North Korea, while the South was supported by the United States. Many of North's laborer and peasant population were in favor of the Soviet policies, while most middle-class Koreans fled to the South, where most of the Korean population resides in the modern day. Michael Robinson, professor emeritus of East Asian Studies and History at the Indiana University, said, quote, "The catalyzing incident is the decision that was made, really without the Koreans involved, between the Soviet Union and the United States to divide Korea into two occupation zones. The ultimate objective was for the Soviet Union and the United States to leave and to let Koreans figure it out. The trouble was that the Cold War intervened, and everything that was tried to create a middle ground or to try to reunify the peninsula was thwarted by both the Soviet Union and the United States not wanting to give in to the other." End quote. November 23, 1945, in Sinwi-yo, North Pyongan province, a communist raid occurred on a local church that was meeting to plan an inauguration for the Christian Social Democratic Party, which was the first political party in North Korea. In this raid, 23 people were killed, which led to huge protests in Sinwi-yo by Christian students, and in Xiangyang, the leader Kim Hwa-sik and 40 others were arrested before the planned inauguration. After World War II and Japan's surrender, the government started to confiscate property at Buddhist temples. Over 15,000 Buddhist, Christian, and other religious organizations were affected. The religious groups, their property now stolen, were totally relying on donations from their members. Education and Christian schools were also put under government control. On November 3, 1946, protests by Christians were held by the 5 Provinces Presbyterian Association, boycotting the general election. In January of 1947, Moon moved into the house of Kim Chong-hwa and her husband Chung Myung-sun, who became leaders in his small religious group. Myung-sun worked at a nearby sock factory that his brother ran, and he supported Moon and his wife. He even made Moon's clothing and did his washing. For the next year or so, Moon held services, and by the end of 1947, there were about 40 regular attendees. In 1948, Moon was excommunicated from the Korean Presbyterian Church as his beliefs were not considered compatible with Orthodox Christianity. He truly believed that he was the Messiah and that he would be able to implant God's love into his followers. According to son Myung Moon, he believed that God created through his inner nature. There are dual expressions of life, which are the casual masculine expression called Sang and the resultant feminine expression called Sang. Son Myung Moon was getting little to no support for his preaching away from the established Christian religion. He was viewed as a nuisance, taking away good Christians from their churches. Many of his followers were prominent figures that gave weekly donations to the church. What Moon was teaching was considered to be heresy, especially considering he was teaching his followers that the second coming of Christ was going to happen in Korea. Many people believed that Moon himself was the new Christ. When ministers visited him to try and understand the theological issues with his beliefs and teachings, he came back at them with biblical explanations. When asked about what his role is, he would tell them to pray about it. He encouraged his followers to pray to the new Christ. Followers had opposition and criticism from their families, and so it caused some followers to doubt, but as their faith grew, it solved their issues. Moon rarely preached about supernatural or spiritual phenomena, nor did he talk about his visions or speak prophecies, nor did he perform healings. He spoke to his followers and gave advice on life and faith. Without government power, the churches were unable to stop Moon from preaching, and so they started to write formal protests against him. There were about 80 complaints that the communist authorities received in early 1948. The complaints stated that he was swindling his followers, he was breaking up families, and committing adultery. On February 22, 1948, Moon was arrested 2 hours before his Sunday service was to start. They also arrested a few other of the members at his service. While they were interrogated and deprived of sleep, one of the followers derived from the experience that the authorities were under the impression that Moon was deceiving his followers so that they donated money to him. He had a trial set on April 3rd, but it was pushed to the 7th so that the communist police and other officials could attend. The trial was billed as Jesus coming from heaven to save the people. It lasted for 4 hours, and Moon was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor in Hunan prison. The prison was essentially an extermination camp where prisoners were worked to death. Few lasted more than 6 months, but he survived. In 1948, the United States sponsored a vote that asked Koreans what they would like to do with the future of the Korean peninsula. The North refused to vote, and so the South created their own government in Seoul that was led by Syngman Rhee, who was staunchly anti-communist. The North then installed the former communist guerrilla Kim Il-sung as its first premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in Pyongyang. On June 25, 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea, approved by the Soviet Union, as there was an attempt to unify the country under one government, which led to the Korean War that killed at least 2.5 million people and did very little to determine which government represented the true Korea. The United States became involved in the military-bombed villages, cities, and towns all along the northern half of the peninsula. UN forces reached Hunan prison about a month after the initial invasion. Knowing that UN forces were coming, the prison authorities started to execute their prisoners. Moon was rescued just hours before his scheduled execution. In 1952, Moon wrote a book called The Divine Principle, which was the scripture for the Unification Church. The scripture is essentially the interpretation of the New and Old Testament with hints of other religions sprinkled in, such as Buddhism, Confucianism, and shamanism. Moon believed that he was chosen by God to save mankind from Satanism. He considered people who identified as communists to be Satan's representatives. He would tell a story that when he was a teenage boy around the age of 15 or 16, he witnessed Jesus appearing before him and said, quote, "God is in great sorrow because of the pain of humankind. You must take on a special mission on earth having to do with heaven's work." End quote. The Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity was officially founded in 1954 in South Korea by Reverend Sun Myung Moon on May 1st. The church became known as Unification Church worldwide. At this time, there were newspapers in Seoul that were printing stories about Moon claiming that he was a North Korean agent and he was throwing sex orgies. He was once again thrown in jail, but no evidence to charge him could be found. He was put in prison the next year when there were charges of him evading the military draft, although that wasn't possible because he was in North Korea at the Hunan prison at the time, and so the charges were dropped. This was after months of news coverage and being confined. Moon continued to present different revelations, which were mostly about the role his family was going to play in restoring God's kingdom and overcoming Lucifer's influence. He said that the most important event for Moon's victory over Satan was when he married his second wife, Hak Ja-han, in which he and his wife would now be able to fulfill the role as true parents, and their children would be true children. In 1960, Sun Myung Moon turned 40 and entered into the holy marriage with Hak Ja-han, a woman who was chosen to be the bride of the Lamb as she had a solid spiritual and Christian background and had always been pious. This holy marriage would then give humankind the true parents. In the Unification Church belief, the true parents represent the very source of true love, true life, and true lineage. They were essentially what Adam and Eve should have become. Jesus was only the spiritual father of those who believed in him because he could never hold the marriage of the Lamb, which is why God had to wait thousands of years for the ideal true parents to be realized. The belief being that only through the true parents can humanity become the true sons and daughters of God. By 1965, Moon was traveling all over the world and visited about 40 countries during that time, trying to spread his message. In 1968, the International Federation for Victory Over Communism, also known as the IFVOC, was established to eventually bring down the downfall of communism. He countered that communism should be fought through educating those on the fallacies of Marxism and Leninism. In the 1950s, the movement started to spread as missionaries were sent to Japan and the West, and scores of members joined in the 1960s. Once Moon started doing speaking tours in the early 1970s, eventually settling in the United States, the church became more known in the United States and Europe. Part of the reason that the movement was so successful in the United States was due to a college professor named Dr. Myung Moon Kim, who brought Moon's teachings to the United States, where she published an English version of Moon's The Divine Principle. Allegedly, Moon was angry that she put her name on the English translation of his book. She ended up being a critical follower of Moon, and the group that she had set up was later the subject for the book Doomsday Cult by John Laughlin. While Moon had expressed gladness that the United States helped to liberate Korea from Japanese rule, he also felt that America had drifted away from its former ideals. By 1972, the church was established in all 50 states. In a move that was kind of odd, when Moon met Richard Nixon, the President of the United States at the time in 1974, he urged for the citizens of the United States to forgive Nixon's transgressions in the Watergate scandal. Moon spread the message of forgive, love, and unite. Despite Nixon being on the verge of impeachment, Moon felt like he was spreading the truth of God. Unsurprisingly, there was a backlash against Moon, and he faced a period of persecution due to his forgive, love, unite message that he was trying to promote. Initially, when the church had come to the United States, it had been somewhat welcome, but after his meeting with Nixon, the news reports started to portray Moon in a bad light. There were allegations dug up about the church brainwashing its followers and portrayed Moon as a hypnotist and an agent of a foreign land. According to tparents.org, the persecution of him was religious and racial in nature. And while it likely does have a basis in that, I also believe that Americans didn't want someone coming to their country and telling them that they should forgive the president after the terrible transgression of the Watergate scandal, which caused much of the country to lose faith in its presidential leader. The Unification Church had lost influence since the 1960s, when Japan was having a period of economic growth. Hiromi Shimada, who works at the Tokyo Women's Christian University as an expert on religion, said, quote, "It was a time of urbanization which produced many new believers. Now that period is over. The believers are aging and not many new ones are joining." End quote. Also, part of the reason it lost its influence was due to its anti-communist mission losing steam after the end of the Cold War, as well as a string of lawsuits being thrown the church's way. Former church member Fumiyaki Tada, which is a pen name, as he says that the church targets as critics, he claimed that the church had manipulated him into joining as a student. He says those who represent the church are withholding their true identities for months and that he was brainwashed and conned out of his money. He said, quote, "They plant fear in you, saying that you are full of sin and corrupted. You will end up in hell and your family will face a similar fate." End quote. According to James Beverly, a professor at Tyndale University College and Seminary in Toronto, said that, quote, "Reverend Moon demanded a lot of members. A lot of them left their families and they lived very sacrificially, especially in the 1970s. Moon claims to be the true father of humanity and his wife the true mother." End quote. Not only are the sins of Adam and Eve taught to followers of Moon, they're also taught about the sins of Japanese colonial rule over Korea in the early 20th century. However, the church offers its followers salvation. For remember, Fumiyaki Tada said, quote, "We are told that we must make up for it with money. So to the church's South Korean headquarters, the Japan branch is their wallet." End quote. Later, Tada became a church official in Sendai. He says that there are fundraising quotas for branches, sub-branches, and even individual followers to meet. Those who could not meet their quotas were told to borrow money in order to do so. Moon had married, raising the ideal family. He pushed this idea onto members of the church and said that in order to restore God's plan, they would need to get married and accept the blessings of their marriage. Thus, the mass weddings that would often take place, which the church became known for, where different couples were paired off, often the couple being from different countries and sometimes didn't even speak the same language. It also renewed vows of people who were already married. Some brides and grooms were meeting their fiancé for the first time on their wedding day. These weddings would take place in stadiums and gymnasiums. These mass weddings would be presided over by Reverend Moon and his wife, and they were called blessings, which originally meant for unificationists that had met certain conditions, but later the blessings included non-unification members. His most famous mass weddings were one in 1982 in Madison Square Garden and one in 1995 in South Korea that had united 360,000 couples. It was not unusual for a member of the church to have an arranged marriage with another member. One member said about his wife that he had met less than a week prior to them getting married that, quote, "Even before you're matched, you know that you're going to base your relationship on internal aspects because you don't know what the person's going to look like," end quote. Moon didn't just have the church under his influence, he also had several businesses, including holdings in industries such as arms manufacturing, mining, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals that allowed him to grow his wealth so that he could pursue his religious agenda. Even after the membership started to die down in the United States, Moon would often appear at events and sponsor events for journalists, scientists, and politicians. He would sometimes even offer large amounts of money for high-profile people to make an appearance. In the late 1960s to early 1970s, there was an anti-cult movement that primarily focused on the Unification Church, the Children of God, Scientology, and Hare Krishnas. Parents whose children joined the Unification Church were filing civil lawsuits and getting help from deprogrammers. Deprogramming has its own set of problems. A classic deprogramming scenario would have a cult member be physically abducted or held at a secret location or forcibly detained when they visit home. For several days, they are being guarded by a security team. Meanwhile, the victim would be presented information from family members, former cult members, and the deprogrammer. The victim would then snap out of the control of the cult. The idea is to reverse brainwashing and the destructive power the cult had over the victim by information control. The issue with deprogramming, which has changed considerably within the last half-century, is that forcibly removing someone from a situation disrespects their bodily autonomy and rights as an individual. And it can be traumatizing, and it can backfire or do more harm than good. The current deprogramming situation is called the Strategic Interactive Approach, which uses warmth and positivity to cultivate a relationship between cult members and their families. It raises questions for the cult members to consider and empowers them to give them the tools they need to understand that their situation is less than ideal. The goal of this is to help reality test. During the 1970s to 80s, the church was accused of brainwashing members into giving Moon large portions of their salary, and they were also accused of using devious recruitment strategies to gain new members. The members that were attracted in the West were mostly young, white, well-educated, middle-class individuals. They would often fundraise and speak to potential recruits in public places. In 1981, Moon was indicted by a federal grand jury in the United States for creating and subscribing false federal income tax returns in the years 1973 to 1975. He was also indicted on conspiracy to file false returns and to obstruct the investigations of the tax returns that were being done by the federal grand jury and the United States Attorney. In particular, this focused on charges that he had done in his name at Chase Manhattan Bank, in which $1.6 million had been deposited from March 1973 to December 1975. Along with that, there was a $50,000 deposit of stock from Tong 11 Enterprises, which is a company that imported ginseng tea and other items from Korea. The government stated that in these accounts and stocks that Moon owned, the receipt did not fail, nor did he report the interest earned on the bank account as taxable income on his tax returns. Moon wanted to dismiss the counts on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct and abuse of the grand jury process. The trial then commenced, and in 1982, although I have read sources that say 1983, Moon was convicted of tax evasion. Many of his followers believe that this was an example of governmental religious persecution. When the indictment was given, Moon had gone back to Korea and was advised to stay there by his lawyers because there was no extradition treaty between Korea and the United States. He didn't follow their advice and returned to the United States. It was then that the U.S. government had convicted him to spend 18 months in federal prison. Those who follow the Unification Church believe that this was a ploy by the United States government to essentially scare Moon out of the United States. He was even supposedly told that they would waive his sentence if he returned to Korea and never came back. He said back to them, quote, "It must be God's will that I go to prison. There must be a providential reason why I must go this way." End quote. And remember, this was not the first time that Moon had been imprisoned. He was also imprisoned in North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. That same year, in 1982, the Washington Times was founded, and it was considered the number 2 daily newspaper in Washington, D.C. Moon had founded it as he felt it would be instrumental in allowing communism to fall peacefully, and it became a newspaper that promoted family values and supported religion within society. Religious leaders in 1984 felt that his indictment was a violation of religious freedom, and there were protests that were happening across the nation due to what was felt to be religious persecution. A United States Senate subcommittee had published this to say about the injustice that they had felt that Moon had faced in the U.S. Quote, "We accused a newcomer to our shores of criminal and intentional wrongdoing for conduct of commonly engaged in by a large percentage of our own religious leaders, namely the holding of church funds and bank accounts in their own names. Catholic priests do it, Baptist ministers do it, and so did Myung Moon. We charged a non-English speaking alien with criminal tax evasion on the first tax returns he filed in this country. It appears that we didn't give him a fair chance to understand our laws. We didn't seek a civil penalty as an initial means of redress. We didn't give him the benefit of any doubt. Rather, we took a novel theory of tax liability of less than $10,000 and turned it into a guilty verdict in 18 months in a federal prison. I do feel strongly after my subcommittee has carefully and objectively reviewed this Reverend Moon's tax case from both sides that injustice rather than justice has been served. The Moon case sends a strong signal that if one's views are unpopular enough, this country will find a way not to tolerate, but to convict. I don't believe that you or I or anyone else, no matter how innocent, could realistically prevail against the combined forces of our Justice Department and judicial branch in a case such as Reverend Moon's." End quote. Moon ended up serving his time in Danbury Federal Prison and was freed after 13 months of his incarceration. By the 1990s, the Unification Church had since gone international. It was present in over 100 countries. It was difficult to determine how many members there may have been within the world. Part of the reason that is because there is a high exaggeration of members that was due to the high profile of Moon, but also more converts were likely to be counted than defectors. But also, the movement wanted to show how successful it was, and they were also in denial as to how many people were leaving the church. There were a bunch of organizations that popped up that embodied the ideals of the Unification Church, such as the Professors' World Peace Academy and the International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences. A lot of the worldwide funding for the church comes from Japan, and Japanese followers were told that they were paying for the sins of their ancestors that allegedly committed these sins during the Japanese colonial rule of Korea in 1910 to 1945. While there was some stability in the church in the early 1990s, by 1995, Japan had experienced the Aum Shinrikyo incident, in which there was a subway attack in Tokyo. 13 people lost their lives and thousands were injured after the release of highly toxic nerve gas, sarin, into the subway system. Sarin is colorless, odorless, and tasteless, and it could cause death in minutes. Due to this attack, Japan was terrified and had an anti-cult mindset. By 1992, the International Women's Federation for World Peace was founded, and Moon's wife, Hakshan Han Moon, began preaching around the world. In 1996, Moon announces that it was the end of an era for the Unification Church and the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, and instead established the Family Federation for World Peace. And 3 years later, the International and Interreligious Federation for World Peace, also known as the IIFWP, was founded, and later became the Universal Peace Federation in 2005, which would be an international council of religious, political, and civic leaders that would work with the United Nations to help keep peace. He especially wanted to create a unified Korea again and help the Middle East achieve peace as well. There was a video that had surfaced in 2004 where Moon was attending a meeting at a U.S. Senate office, which was also attended by some members of Congress. In the meeting, Moon declared himself the Messiah and said that he had spoken to the spirits of both Stalin and Hitler, and they had found strength in what he taught, and they both mended their ways. Let us not forget that Stalin's approval of North Korea invading South Korea, what not only led to millions of Koreans dying, but to the South and North being permanently separated. On September 3, 2012, Moon took his last breath at the age of 92. He passed away due to complications from pneumonia. He was buried on Mount Cheongsang in Gyeonggi, which was described as the Holy Land of the Church. On Friday, July 8, 2022, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot while giving a campaign speech in front of the Yamato Saidaiji railway station. He was rushed to the hospital via airlift, but by the time he got to the hospital, his heart had stopped. The suspect, Tetsuya Yamagami, was arrested and had admitted to shooting Abe with what appeared to be a homemade weapon. Yamagami was 41 years old at the time and told the police that he had a long-standing grudge against the Unification Church because his mother had donated nearly $750,000 to the church, which had bankrupted the family. Former member Fumiaki Tada, who was mentioned earlier, eventually was able to leave the church after his family convinced him to, and he successfully sued the church. He says of Abe's suspected killer Yamagami that, quote, "He was a child of a believer, and he had nobody to talk to. This is one of the reasons he committed the crime, and I feel sorry for that." End quote. The original target was not Abe, but instead was Hakshan Han Moon, the widow of son Myung Moon. Yamagami had allegedly made plans to kill other members of the church, but when he saw a video message that Abe had created at a church-linked event, he decided he was going to target him instead. The Unification Church distanced itself from Abe's assassination, and Tomohiro Tanaka, who is the president of the Japanese branch for the Unification Church, whose official name is the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, had declared in a press conference that Yamagami was not part of the church, but did confirm that Yamagami's mother was. Tanaka said, quote, "As for the motive for suspect Yamagami's crime and the donation issue reported by the media, we'd like to refrain from discussing it as the case is under police investigation." End quote. As discussed earlier, the Unification Church has a connection to Japan due to Japanese occupation of Korean territory in the early 20th century. Abe has a long-standing history with the church that goes back generations in his family. His father, Shintaro Abe, and his grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, were both tied to the church. At the end of World War II, Kishi was in prison as a suspected war criminal. During his time in prison, he contacted other right-wing nationalists, which included politician Ryoichi Sasakawa. In 1968, Myung Moon created an anti-communist group in South Korea and made Sasakawa the honorary chairman of the Japanese branch. The headquarters happened to be located next to Kishi's residence. Hiromi Shimada, who works at Tokyo's Women Christian University and is an expert on religion, had said, quote, "They established the Federation for Victory over Communism and Kishi supported it. And this situation laid the foundation for Abe's assassination." End quote. Abe's Liberal Democratic Party had volunteers that were provided by the church during election time. Japanese Defense Minister Nobuo Kishi, Abe's brother, said that in the past, Unification Church members had volunteered in his own election campaigns. After Abe's death, there was a lot of speculation that other lawmakers had links to the church that caused Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to order an investigation. Later, it was told by him to reporters that those linked to the church had cut ties with the group, as there was a concern that the Unification Church was trying to yield political power. In October 2023, the government of Japan asked the court to order the dissolution of the Unification Church Japanese branch after the assassination of Shinzo Abe. In January of that same year, Japanese prosecutors had indicted the alleged killer of Abe, Yamagami, on firearm charges and murder. The Japanese government concluded that the practices of the church, such as fundraising that pressured their followers to make huge donations, violated the 1951 Religious Corporations Act. Japan's Ministry of Cultural Affairs had gathered testimonies from about 170 people who stated that they were pressured into giving a bunch of money in donation in what was referred to as spiritual sales, and that they were also convinced to buy amulets and urns with the idea that buying those items will appease their ancestors and help save future generations. This law allows for the Japanese courts to dissolve a religious group if the group is found to, quote, clearly found to harm public welfare substantially, end quote. This is the third time that the Japanese courts have ordered the dissolution of a church due to the violation of the 1951 Act. In 1987, the National Lawyers Network Against Spiritual Sales was established specifically to oppose the Unification Church due to damages being incurred over selling urns and amulets. The total sale coming to around $1 billion, spanning about 20 years to December of 2006. These spiritual sales were sold and told to the victims of these transactions that made people pay through deception and intimidation, and were said to relieve the buyer of any sort of damned karma from their ancestors. Items were sold for exorbitant amounts of money. If Japan was able to strip the church of its corporate status, which could take up to 2 years, it would be harder to control, as losing their religious status would no longer fall under Japan's Ministry of Education and Cultural Affairs, which would make it harder to regulate. The Unification Church stood by its decisions and said that the news coverage against them is fake and biased. They released a statement saying that the dissolution order was very regrettable and that they were working on reforming the church since 2009 and also planned on making legal arguments against the Japanese court. If the Unification Church is disbanded, what would that mean? It would mean that it would lose its religious corporation status in Japan and would not be allowed access to the tax benefits. However, it could still act as a corporation. There is a fear that by disbanding the group, it will only push their activities further underground. This isn't the first time that the church has been suspected of illegal or unethical activity and behavior. Between 1991 and 2003, Naomi Hanma, a former Unification Church member, had said that she worked on a legal case called Give Us Back Our Youth, a lawsuit that had stated that the church used manipulative and deceptive techniques to recruit new members. According to Article 20 of Japan's Constitution, this violated the freedom of thought and conscience. The trial lasted 14 years, and there was a nearly 1,000-page report that outlined the mind control methods that the church used on potential members. The Sapporo court ruled in favor of the 20 former Unification members who had sued the church as part of the case. The church was ordered to pay 29.5 million yen, which is about $200,000 in American dollars, as part of the damages for the indoctrination and recruitment of new members. Quote, while hiding the church's true identity, coercing some former members into purchasing expensive items, and donating large amounts of money. End quote. I'm going to end this episode with a quote from Sun Myung Moon that I feel summarizes perfectly what the Unification Church's true agenda was. And that is, quote, the whole world is in my hand, and I will conquer and subjugate the world. End quote. Please subscribe to my podcast. And if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Myers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.